And that's the speed triple reviewed for you in 3 seconds. Woohoo when you twist the accelerator, followed by an expletive when you glance at the speedometer and realise what speed you've been doing on a public road. If you haven't just switched off, welcome back to the Algarve. Fun Christmas fact, the name Algarve actually comes from the Arabic Algarve, meaning the west, because that's where it was to the North African invaders in the 8th century, to the west of Spain. Anyway, to the matter in hand, the Speed Triple RS, and more specifically, how it compares to my Speed Twin. Now, I think we would all agree that both these bikes have pretty much been reviewed to death now, so I'm not going to go into any of the technical details, options, engine specs, etc. There are plenty of other excellent videos out there for that. No, what I want to look at today is how the two bikes feel to ride and how they are or would be to live with every day. I first reviewed the 2021 Speed Triple back in May, a link to the video in the corner and in the description, comparing it to the Trident 660 I owned at the time and the Street Triple I owned back in 2017. If you can't be bothered watching that review, I concluded the Speed Triple was basically a super Trident that rectified most of the latter's failings. Offering over twice the power of the Trident, I wanted one desperately, but as it was also over twice the price of the Trident, there's no way that was going to happen. 6 months down the line, and thanks in part, it has to be said, to you for watching this channel, things have moved on. I now own a Speed Twin, so how does the Triple compare to that? Well, let me say straight off the bat that the gap is still there, but it has definitely narrowed, and I don't desire the Triple as much as I used to. Let me explain why. First of all, the looks. Well, these are two such differently styled bikes that I'm not even going to begin to argue which is the better looking. In my opinion, for what it's worth, the Twin is a very good looking modern classic, possibly the best looking modern classic on the market, along with the Kawasaki Z900 RS, whereas the Triple is striking and aggressive in a sporty way. It's not ugly, but it's not exactly what most people would describe as beautiful either. I get the frame has been built with rigidity and lightness in mind, and the welds are beautifully done, but I've never been fond of the tentacle-like design. I don't know, it just looks a bit too sea creature-y to me. Fit and finish? Well, same factory, same equipment suppliers, and presumably the same people putting it all together, so no surprise that the two bikes are much of a muchness in terms of perceived quality. The Triple screen is more legible, sort of, depending on where you are in the menus. It can get all a bit too excitable, and some of the animations, like the throbbing red speedo dial when in sport mode, are a bit over the top. I also prefer the Triple's left-hand controls. They're not quite as chunky feeling as those on the BMW or as intuitive, but they are better than those on the Twin. So anyway, what's the Triple like to ride? 180 horsepower against 100 horsepower? No comparison, right? Well, yes and no. The first thing I noticed as I pulled off the dealer's forecourt on the Speed Triple, having ridden there on my Speed Twin, was the lack of torque. Sure, it's there if you want to wait for it. In fact, there's ultimately a bit more, 125 Newton meters, 95 foot-pounds, to the Twin's 112 or 83 foot-pounds. But you don't get that until you've raced all the way around to 9,000 revs. The Twin will give you everything it's got between about 3 and 5,000 RPM, and there's so much on tap that you barely have to worry about which gear you're in as you prepare to overtake. Twist and go, almost like a scooter, only with a lot more shove. European viewers might remember the turbo diesel engines we got in the 90s and early 2000s. Volkswagen's TDIs and BMW's big straight sixes and even V8s. Okay, so they were a bit noisy and smelly, and they've definitely gone out of fashion now, but boy were they nice to drive. They offered prodigious low-down torque and consequently could often match or even beat the equivalent petrol engine models, especially in mid-range pickup. Well, the Speed Twin is a bit like that, huge pulling power up to about 5,000 RPM, but after that there's not a great deal left. The Speed Triple is just the opposite, not an awful lot happening until 5,000 RPM, and then suddenly you're almost literally catapulted forwards in what feels like increments of 10 miles per hour. You're riding at about 50 miles an hour, waiting patiently to overtake the van in front, knock it down to second and warp drive. 2 seconds later you're doing 100 and are already at the next bend. So which is better? Well, it all depends on your riding style. I personally prefer the lazy, punchy twin, but if you're in the mood for some high revving revelry, then the triple definitely excels. Brakes, well, it's an easy win for the triple here. The 2022 twin gets big Brembo M50 calipers, and I operated mine further by fitting some sintered pads from EBC for improved bite and a racier feel. They are very good, but they still can't match the triple stylemas with adjustable attack. The result is exceptional stopping power, the sort that frankly makes you wonder how manufacturers dare put anything less on other bikes. All brakes should be this good in my opinion. So how about sound? Well, for me the twin wins every time. It's as simple as that. I used to like the raspy tones and induction roar of the triple, both on this 1200 speed and on the 765 street triple I had. But on this ride I actually began to find it a bit artificial, almost irritating after the twin's natural V8-like burble. As befits its modern classic style, the twin has an almost perfectly flat seat that has the advantage of allowing you to shuffle back and forth while riding as the mood takes you. It's one of those seats you sort of forget about, to be honest. It's neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. You just sit on it and don't really think about it again. The handlebars are relatively high and the foot pegs relatively far forward compared to the Thruxton, for example. So the overall riding position is sort of middle ground, north of a sports bike, south of a Goldwing. I've replaced the stock rear shocks on my twin with some mid-range YSS models, which I've dialed back for maximum comfort both on damping and rebound. I've still had enough after an hour and a half though and need to stop for a stretch, or more often than not, given the meagre range, a fuel stop, but that's the case with most bikes. The Speed Triple's riding position is much sportier. The seat holds you firmly in place, no shuffling around here, and cants you forward over the tank, face downwards towards the clocks. It's not uncomfortable as such, and the suspension, much decried by journalists at launch for being so rock hard, seems okay to me. Compared to my twin, it's loud and exhilarating, but a bit like a fairground ride. It's one of those bikes that I'm glad when it's over and it's time to get off. A cross-continental cruiser this is not, but it was never designed to be, and I'm fine with that. You just need to be aware of what type of riding you're buying into. So what about handling? Well, the twin is surprisingly good given its weight, shape and unassuming pretensions. But the triple is on a different level. It's a scalpel, one of the best, if not the best chassis I've ever ridden. Take a bend at seemingly any speed and the triple just guides you round, begging you to go faster. Triumph's engineers always manage to find the optimal settings for all their bikes. And of course here on the Speed Triple, they were given an extra dollop of help from the gurus at Öhlins, Metzeler and Brembo. The result is a bike that is far more competent than I am, and I certainly wasn't prepared to seek out its limits on a public road like this, especially as it wasn't my bike. Suffice it to say that the Triple has more than enough ability in the handling department and takes an easy win over the twin, which felt slightly staid in comparison when I jumped back on it. Both bikes have the same tyres, so there's no shortage of grip, but the superior suspension of the Triple means this was always going to be an easy victory. So, in conclusion, is the Speed Triple a superior bike to the Speed Twin? I suppose the best way of answering that is by saying, yes, it is superior, but I don't want one. I think there's a window in life when the Speed Triple is the perfect bike, an age when you're both sensible, but relatively flexible, physically speaking. Buy one when you're in your 20s and you'll likely lose your license, or worse, within a few weeks. Get one at my age and the constant adrenaline rushes will provoke heart failure, or at the very least, give you backache from the sporty riding position and relatively firm suspension. It's a fantastic bike for half an hour, but it's just a bit too hardcore for me. And it has to be said, the two 40-something sales managers at Triumph Algarve, who were keen to hear my thoughts when I returned the bike, they both agreed that they preferred the Speed Twin as a bike to own, but would always be up for a 30-minute blast on the triple. Both bikes are 1200s, but they couldn't be more different to ride. The Twin is fast at low speed, the triple is very fast at very high speed, if that makes sense. If you want instant power up to about 80 miles an hour without necessarily having to worry about which gear you're in, then the Twin is the bike for you. If, on the other hand, you like riding everywhere above 70 miles an hour and at high revs, then go for the triple. And I mean on the road, of course, because if you want a track bike, you'd be better off with the about-to-be-launched Speed Triple RR, or, of course, on a full sports bike. When I rode the Speed Triple as a Trident owner 6 months ago, I wanted one desperately. But now I'll stick with my Speed Twin. It's more discreet, more comfortable, produces a wonderful sound, and has more than enough power to get me out of and into trouble on the public roads. The Triple is an adrenaline rush, a fairground ride, and if that's the type of bike you're after, then I highly recommend it. So, time for the Rocket Score. Well, I already scored the Triumph Speed Triple a few weeks ago when I was originally putting the Rocket Score together, based on my test from 6 months ago. I opened up the spreadsheet for this video convinced I was going to alter most of the marks, but having looked through the figures, I actually think I rated it pretty fairly the first time, so I've actually left the scores as they were. Styling, not a classically beautiful bike and not one I would expect to be heralded as a work of art in the foreseeable future, but not downright ugly, so 6 out of 10 still seems fair. Quality, Triumph's usual attention to perceived quality and the use of some good components, notably suspension, brakes and tyres, justifies the 9 out of 10. Engine, this is a work of art, bags of torque and a seemingly unlimited amount of horsepower for the road, but you do have to work it a little bit to get the most out of it, 8 out of 10. Handling, about as good a setup as I've ever ridden, though I'm no racer and wouldn't pretend to be in a position to test this bike to its limit, 8 out of 10. Comfort, not uncomfortable for such a potent machine, but you are canted forward, which can become tiring. The suspension is on the firm side, obviously, and the seat shape doesn't allow for much room to stretch, 5 out of 10. The brakes, Brembo stylemas are the best I've ever experienced, and on a bike as light as this, they provide almost ridiculous levels of stopping power, an easy 9 out of 10. Commuting, well, you can go to work on just about any bike, of course, and you would undoubtedly arrive pumped at the office if this were your transport of choice, but after a hard day's graft, you might not be in the mood for the ride back home, and luggage capacity is almost non-existent, so 5 out of 10. Value, compared to many of its competitors, the Speed Triple is well priced, but it's still a €20,000 bike here in Portugal, and I do begin to ask myself questions when faced with motorcycles that cost more than a car, so 4 out of 10. Finally, the grin factor, well, this is what the Speed Triple is all about in my opinion, a scratch in the mountains or a thrash around the track, an easy 9 out of 10. So, the final score remains unchanged and the bike stays in second place, just behind the Speed Twin, which for me offers a more balanced, if ultimately less exhilarating experience. Must be my age. As always, thanks for watching.